So hello and welcome to our final speaker series for the 2021-22 school year. Today we will continue our discussion from February about the theme Representation Matters by taking a look from the Asian American and Pacific Islander or AAPI perspective. Today's discussion is important because AAPI people face a rising number of hate crimes and bias incidents, especially since the pandemic started. In January 2022, New Jersey also passed AAPI legislation, which we'll hear a little more about today, that requires AAPI history to be included in social studies classrooms in New Jersey. New Jersey is the second state to require an AAPI curriculum, with Illinois being the first. Curious about that one. Representation matters, and we are proud to continue this discussion with you today. The Center for Future Educators at TCNJ is an organization that works to recruit future educators from middle and high schools around the state of New Jersey through conferences, NJFEA chapters, Tomorrow's Teachers courses, and our Summer Academy. I am your host, Dr. Jean Del Coley, the Executive Director of the CFE, and this is our speaker series where we have monthly conversations with exemplary educators about all things education. The purpose of our speaker series is to provide future educators in New Jersey the opportunity to see the many facets of the profession, and we hope to provide a little bit of inspiration. All of our speaker series events are recorded and available to view on our website. We'll have the Q&A box available for later in the program, and this is a reminder that this program is being recorded and will be available on the CFE website at futureeducators.tcnj.edu next week, and we'll drop that in the chat box for you. It takes collaboration to make the CFE and its programming possible. The center is graciously funded by NJEA, and we are grateful that their support means we can bring programming like this to you. Today's guest is Sima Kumar, a New Jersey educator who teaches at the high school and college levels. She's a board member of Make Us Visible New Jersey, a grassroots coalition that was responsible for gaining support and passing the AAPI curriculum bill that Governor Murphy signed into law on January 18th of this year. She testified at Assembly and Senate Education Committee meetings in support of these bills. Starting in the 2022-2023 school year, this law makes it mandatory for K-12 schools to include Asian American and Pacific Islander history and contributions in their curriculums. Sima published an article in the October 2021 issue of the NJEA Review called Asian American in America's Literary Heritage that explored the origins of the invisibility of Asian American literature and history in the K-12 curricula. Sima grew up in Ohio, where she completed her K-12 education in public and private schools. She earned a BA from Smith College, where she majored in biochemistry, and an M.F.A. in creative writing from Vermont College of the Arts. This summer, she will be entering the Ed.D program at Rutgers University. I can't wait to see what we learn today. Last but not least, we have our marvelous moderator, Kimberly Dixteen Hughes, the sorceress of sonnets and the guardian of grammar, who also happens to be the 2020 New Jersey State Teacher of the Year and an English Language Arts teacher at Haddonfield Memorial High School. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Sima to get us started on today to talk to us about her amazing journey here and what AAPI education looks like. Over to you, Sima.
Thank you so much, Jean. I'm so pleased to be here. Thank you for this invitation. And I imagine it's after school for most of you, so thank you for taking the time to tune in. I wish I'd had a program like this available to me to know that the teaching was a profession I could choose, that it was a track that I could take because of my natural skill set. So as you know, my name is Sima Kumar, and I'm a high school teacher. My students call me Ms. Kumar. I teach language arts and journalism. As Jean mentioned, I'm also an adjunct professor. I'm still an adjunct professor at our local community college, Mercer County Community College, where I've taught first and second semester English. I guess I should start now with where I was born and where I grew up. So let me start my slide presentation. So this is a little bit about my family history and where I was born. I was born at a medical college hospital where my father was a medical student. This was in India, and you can see that India is yellow here, and I'm sorry for the blurriness of this image. The medical school was called Darbhanga Medical School in the city of Darbhanga. I was raised in a nearby town called Barhaya by my aunt, who was a school teacher. She was my first teacher. I stayed with her until I was 6 years old. This is a picture of me when I was 3. This is my Indian passport picture. And I remember being in her classroom and writing my letters on a handheld chalkboard and singing songs. This is my origin, and my aunt was my first teacher. This is a picture of my aunt. She is the petite woman. I'm petite in real life as well, but she's even more petite than I am. And we are standing together on the rooftop of a neighbor's home. So my family's house, where I spent my childhood, is actually across the street. And I wish I could say it's across the street in this, 2-story gorgeous home with the dome, but it's actually the next house. It's the 1-story home that's painted a light blue, if you can see it. So this is my aunt, and as I mentioned, she was my first teacher. And this is my origin. I'm an immigrant. My parents immigrated to the US in 1973. This is a picture of my parents. I joined them in the winter of 1977. I remember it was winter because I'd never seen snow until then, and it still stands out in my memory, though it has been so long ago. I want to talk about some other family members because it's important to who I am. My uncle was the first in my family to immigrate to the United States. I wish I had a photo of him to share with you, but I couldn't find one. I think my mother has all those pictures, and I just wasn't able to get it together. My uncle arrived in this country in the late 50s. Like many Indian immigrants who arrived in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and even today, my uncle entered through the gateway of an American university. After finishing his PhD and postdoc, he received a permanent position at the University of Colorado at Denver. His area of research was cancer. His lab needed smart young people to do research. My dad fit that bill, and the 1965 Immigration and Naturalization Act allowed for the immigration of family members. My uncle sponsored my dad and provided him with his first job. Once my father passed his foreign medical exams, he was recruited to, of all places, Ohio, where he worked at St. Charles Hospital and later opened his own practice. My dad is still working, though not as strenuously, at the age of 73. And of course, you can figure out that I grew up in Ohio. I spent, all my, K through 12 schooling in Ohio. Pursuing STEM fields opened doors and opportunity for my uncle, father, and other members of my family. It's because the male members of my family had MD degrees that they gained entry into the US and are all thriving doctors in America. My uncle was the only PhD, and he always regretted not getting that MD degree. The 1965 Immigration and Naturalization Act changed the demographics of this country. That's a hard word, demographics. Asian immigrants arrived in large numbers in the United States. Because this law made preference for immigrants with professional degrees, the majority of Asians who immigrated around this time were professionals, scientists, doctors, and engineers. This act not only changed the demographics of America, but it also laid the foundation for the model minority stereotype. I want to talk a little bit more about this act. As I mentioned, the 1965 Immigration Act brought immigrants with professional degrees. When I was growing up in Ohio, the Indian adults I knew were either doctors, scientists, or engineers. The unintended effect of the 1965 Immigration Act was that the children of these immigrants were assumed to have the same skill set and life goals as their parents. Thus, we have the model minority stereotype. The model minority stereotype, you might know, assumes students of Asian heritage are good at school, particularly excelling in math and science, and that they are quiet, well-behaved, and don't make trouble by questioning the status quo. The model minority myth was debilitating to me as a young person, and maybe why I didn't realize that the teaching profession was a viable option for me until so much later in life. So after graduating high school, I left Ohio to attend Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts. In college, I was on the pre-med track and was a miserable biochemistry major. I graduated with a Bachelor of Arts. I then moved to New York and worked as a lab technician at NYU Medical School. That was my very first job out of college, and later worked in a similar position at Columbia Presbyterian Hospital. And I was miserable. Somehow, I applied to a PhD program and was accepted to a university in upstate New York in microbiology. And I was miserable. So I dropped the program without completing the first semester. In upstate New York, I started taking writing classes at the local arts center in town where I lived and gained confidence as a writer. I think I was trying to make sense of my life, and writing became a form of therapy. I applied to one M.F.A program in writing. So M.F.A stands for Masters of Fine Arts. So I applied to one M.F.A program in writing and was accepted. The institution had a slightly different name when I was there, but it is now called Vermont College of Fine Arts, and it's one of the best writing programs in the country. The program was what's called a low residency program, which means that you visit the campus for a 2-week stretch at the beginning of each semester. You're paired with an advisor with whom you chart out the course of your semester, your readings, and your writing output. You then return to your normal life. You're living the life of a writer, basically, and you correspond with your advisor every 3 to 4 weeks, sending priority mail packets and receiving lengthy critiques of your work and letters from your advisor. It was a really wonderful time, and I met some brilliant minds. The poet Billy Collins was one of the guest speakers one year that I was there. So you're probably wondering, so how did you, Ms. Kumar, get into teaching? So some years passed, I had a child, and we moved to New Jersey when my son was ready to enter kindergarten. I started in the teaching profession as an adjunct professor. So I started at the college level, and I taught at the local colleges and universities. And then I decided to enter the alternate route to teaching program, and I completed all that successfully. I landed a full-time position, and 6 years have passed, and I've been a high school language arts teacher. And I continue to, teach at the college level. So I'm still an adjunct professor as well. So some of my influential teachers, I wanted to show you this. Mrs. Benneth Morrow was my AP US history teacher, and she was also the principal of my high school. When I was in her class, I remember she supplemented the textbook, which was very heavy, with 2 softcover books about women's history. This was in the late 80s, and looking back, I realized how progressive this was for her. The year I graduated from high school, this is 1989, she left the school too. And that during graduation or towards the end of the year, and as we got towards graduation, she gave every single student a gift, and that gift was a book. And the book that she gave me was The Woman Warrior by Maxine Hong Kingston. And it was this novel was actually published in 1975, and I still have it, and I still have her inscription, which is a bit faded now, but I just want to read the inscription to you all. To Sima, with love and respect, another of our voices to keep you company as you continue to develop your own. Love always, Benneth Morrow, June 1989. This has always been very special to me. And the book is, a bit tattered now. And actually this whiteout, if I can just explain that. I think my mother had used the paper to write someone's phone number on it. So I just blotted it out. But this book remains dear to me. And just as a way of coming full circle, I'm happy to say that I taught the first chapter of this book to my sophomores just a few weeks ago. We'd finished reading The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Maxine Hong Kingston has said that the first chapter of her novel is a rewriting of the story of Hester Prynne. So the first chapter is called No Name Woman. So my students and I looked at how Kingston reshaped and transformed the story of Hester Prynne, and yet how she remained true to Hawthorne's theme. This thematic pairing across community experiences and time periods is my pedagogical approach to creating a more inclusive curriculum. Another teacher who had a great deal of influence on me was someone who didn't actually teach me. I was never in her classroom, but she did one of the kindest things. She introduced me to my first South Asian American writer. I'd never read anything by a Indian author, works in translation, or I'd never heard of a South Asian American author. So she introduced me to Bharati Mukherjee, and she gave me a copy of The Tiger's Daughter, which is Mukherjee's first novel. And Bharati Mukherjee, like Maxine Hong Kingston, they were contemporaries. They were the first ones. So for South Asian Americans, Bharati Mukherjee is the first one to enter the American literary canon. Maxine Hong Kingston is, her novel, The Woman Warrior, is a milestone in Asian American literature and American literature, I would say. She really opened the doors to other Asian American writers to, be accepted into the popular culture, into the literary canon. So, The Woman Warrior is such an important book, and in teaching American literature at the high school level, this is the book that, from my perspective, really needs to be incorporated. And I was able to do it this year. So I didn't teach the entire novel, but I did teach the first chapter and paired it with The Scarlet Letter. And it was, a really fruitful pairing and wonderful discussion with my students. So Mrs. Hope Stevens, she introduced me to my first South Asian American author. And, it was just a revelation to me. Teachers have always known that representation matters in school learning. This wasn't a book that was part of my English curriculum in my school, but my teacher was, kind enough to introduce me to the author and her work because, we know that mirrors, windows, and sliding doors, even, in the late 80s, teachers knew that, that representation is something that matters to students. And, I was one of, in my class, I was one of two Indian American kids in my class. In my senior year, I was in Mr. Sandy McPeck's English class, and we read, that class focused on world literature. We read a bunch of wonderful books. And I remember, the idea of multiculturalism being something that was talked about a lot in the 80s, late 80s or early 90s. And my school was very much aware of it. And, we had this class where we read V.S. Naipaul's A Bend in the River, Saul Bellows, Henderson the Rain King, Toni Morrison's Tar Baby, Alice Walker's The Color Purple, and other books as well. So this conversation about multiculturalism, is a conversation we've been having for a long time. So it was surprising to me to enter high school in 2015 is when I joined, in the fall of 2015, and to see the curriculum as not actually progressing but actually regressing into I would say less diverse, texts. So that was my observation, and it was, a little bit surprising, I would say. So, of course, these were, teachers that influenced me in high school, but my first teacher was my aunt. And here's a picture of my aunt and my mom in Pennsylvania. I've always loved that they're in front of a sign stating that Pennsylvania is the birthplace of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. These two foundational documents influence in some way, I know it does, in some way, my teaching pedagogy. I think most obviously in creating a more inclusive curriculum. And it's hard not to quote the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is the classroom teacher it is in the classroom that as a teacher, I can reinforce this ideal among my students, this ideal that holds this country together. So that's something I see as my role as a teacher, and as a teacher who teaches American literature. That's the course I've taught since I joined high school teaching. I want to talk a little bit about how I got involved with Make Us Visible New Jersey. It's my passion project. I joined Make Us Visible New Jersey just before the Atlanta spa shootings that killed 8 people, 6 of whom were Asian women. Around that time, I read an article in The Nation magazine called "The Roots of the Atlanta Shooting Go Back to the First Law Restricting Immigration." This article helped me understand my discomfort in the way the media and law enforcement was telling the story. In the article, Mari Uehara describes the alarmingly sympathetic and humanizing description by the captain of the Cherokee County Sheriff's Office of the white male murderer, saying the murderer claimed it's not racially motivated, and that he had a sexual addiction, and that he had come to the spas to eliminate that addiction. The sheriff, however, said nothing about the humanity of the women who had lost their lives. Why was the murderer more visible to the sheriff than the women who were murdered? This was my thinking, my questions. I want to just talk a little bit about some history. The first law barring the immigration of a certain group of people was called the Page Act. And that law was passed in 1875. And this law prohibited the immigration of Chinese women for immoral purposes. Many people attribute this law as the seed to the idea of Asian women as sexualized, exotic, expendable objects. So, as you know, anti-Asian hate crimes continue. And the efforts of Make Us Visible New Jersey was driven by the belief that education is the antidote to hate. The coalition is made up of an amazing group of students, parents, educators, and community members who advocated for the inclusion of AAPI studies in K-12 curricula in New Jersey public schools. Make Us Visible New Jersey is part of a larger national organization called Just Make Us Visible. And this organization, it started in Connecticut. Make Us Visible has state chapters in Florida, Georgia, California, Pennsylvania, and other states. New Jersey is the second state to pass AAPI curriculum legislation. It's disappointing we weren't the first, but I guess second is okay. Illinois was the first state. Okay. So I just want to talk a little bit about how we successfully passed this legislation. And just, if I might read just a description of the legislation. Governor Murphy signed legislation that will ensure that the contributions, history, and heritage of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are included in the New Jersey State Learning Standards for Social Studies for students in kindergarten through grade 12. So how did we do it? Number one, we accomplished this by networking. Social media was key for this. Using our personal connection at every level, from schools to politicians to reporters and so on. Strong leadership. I can't, emphasize how very important strong leadership. And the founder of Make Us Visible New Jersey is a doctor. She's a psychiatrist, actually, and she's a social activist. And her name is Dr. Connie Ilan Govin. And she was the force and is the force that keeps our goals in sight. And the third, reason that we did it, we had a strong purpose. We had this very strong belief, we have this very strong belief that education is the antidote to hate. The other purpose that drove us was our children. We want them to feel safe in this country. We want them to have a sense of belonging as Americans because they are American. So I talked about the model minority stereotype. There's another stereotype that is, too often associated with Asian Americans, and that is the stereotype that they are perpetual foreigners. It's true, some Asian Americans have just arrived. They may, still identify themselves as Asians, but there are also other people of Asian heritage who have been here for 2 generations, 3 generations. They may have helped build the Transcontinental Railroad. So, this idea of Asians as perpetual foreigners is also very harmful. It creates a sense of not belonging. So what does AAPI mean? That's my slide for Make Us Visible New Jersey. That's our logo. So let me just talk a little bit about this. We are a very, very diverse group of people. So AAPI is a designation that was created by the government. Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, that's what AAPI stands for, are an integral part of the American cultural mosaic, encompassing a wide range of diversity. AAPI communities consist of approximately 50 ethnic groups speaking over 100 languages. All right, so all of that 50 ethnic groups speaking 100 languages is clumped under this designation, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, AAPI. Okay, so more specifically, AAPI encompasses people who have their origins in the Far East, the Indian subcontinent, or the Pacific Islanders, the Pacific Islands. So this encompasses a wide range of countries: China, Japan, Korea, Indonesia, the Philippines, Singapore, Samoa, Thailand, Vietnam. If we take a look at South Asia itself, South Asia is made up of all these countries: India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, and Bhutan. So just a couple of things about the AAPI community. Is the fastest growing racial group in the country, growing over 4 times as rapidly as the total US population, and it's expected to double to over 47 million by 2060. In terms of New Jersey, the Asian American population is the fastest growing racial group in the state. And compromises 10.4% of the population. 6 school districts, I think it might be 7 in New Jersey, have tipped to more than 50% of students of Asian heritage. And this is significant. As a friend pointed out to me, this means that the reality of some Asian American students is that they may live in communities where the majority of the population looks like them, but their school curriculum does not represent their experience in the American history or American literature classroom. So this becomes additionally problematic because nationally, according to the 2020 census data, this generation of young people, that's those of you listening in, you are the most racially and ethnically diverse generation this country has ever produced. According to a recent report by Jersey Promise, a nonprofit policy, education, and advocacy organization, the face of education is rapidly changing in our state. The majority of our 1.37 million students enrolled, that is 56%, just a couple of years ago, are students of color. There's no longer a racial group that makes up a majority of the enrollment in public schools. Okay. I just wanted to mention some important dates. The history of Asian Americans has been predominantly invisible in the curriculum. And these are some, early dates that are important in recognizing, and hopefully, this coming year, next year, I guess it will be next year in school, your history teachers will incorporate some of these significant moments in Asian American history. I think it's really interesting that, in 1862, during the Civil War, hundreds of Asian and Pacific Islander men actually, took part in the Civil War, and we don't know that. We don't know that part of the story. Just want to talk just very, very briefly about one aspect of history that we all learn, and that is the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education, law that desegregated American schools. And last summer I took just a bunch of PD courses just to learn this history that I wasn't taught. And most students, I would say probably all of you, are not taught this wider, more inclusive history of America. And in particular, this particular story that I want to recall, regarding school desegregation. So a really useful website is the Asian American Education Foundation. And if you go to their lessons tab, you'll find this wonderful unit on school desegregation that expands the story, as I mentioned, of the landmark 1954 Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Board of Education. In this unit, students learn of two cases that preceded the 1954 decision. And these are cases I never learned about. The first case is the 1885 Tate versus Hurley case, and the 1947 Mendez versus Westminster case. In a different talk that I gave some weeks ago, I was told that there is a book for the younger grades. I think it might have been the elementary level, that talks about the 1947 Mendez versus Westminster case, which is so cool. I'm so glad that younger kids are learning just a more expansive story about school desegregation in this country. So if I might just tell you a little bit about the 1947 case, it involved Sylvia Mendez, a student of Mexican origin, who was turned away from a whites-only public school in California. The lawyer representing Sylvia Mendez argued that segregation resulted in feelings of inferiority among Mexican-American children that could undermine their ability to be productive Americans. A similar argument was made in the 1954 decision that ended school segregation. So before Brown, which was the 1954 decision, before Mendez, there was the Tate case. In 1885, the Tate versus Hurley case involved a Chinese-American family who wanted to enroll their American-born daughter, Mamie, at the local all-white primary school. The principal of the school, Jenny Hurley, denied their daughter entrance. Mamie's parents, Joseph and Mary Tate, sued and took the case to the California Supreme Court. The California Supreme Court decided in favor of Mamie Tate, saying that the San Francisco Board of Education could not deny Mamie Tate's 14th Amendment rights and the opportunity to attend the school. The court did not, however, say that segregated schools were against the law. So the San Francisco School Board built a separate school for Chinese students rather than integrating the public school. So though the outcome of this case was not integration, this case is important to learn about because it places Asian Americans in 19th century America. It shows Asian Americans actively pursuing their rights as Americans. So representation matters.
I couldn't take notes fast enough, and mostly out of selfish reasons, because I was thinking about how I could integrate this more into my literature curriculum and how to supplement all of the learning that happens in our classrooms beyond a social studies classroom. Even though the focus of this law, which is very exciting, right, is in social studies, we should really start thinking outside of those spaces. So our students have put together questions for you, and you have provided so much information to answer a lot of those questions in advance. So I'm going to jump around a little bit. All of the work that you've done, Sima, has really helped schools and helped educators really approach structural racism in these institutions. And our students are wondering if you could define structural racism and what's its purpose to our audience.
That is a loaded question.
That was their number one question. So good on them.
Everything. Oh my gosh, that is loaded. All right, so this one's going to take a little bit of time.
Go for it.
So here's the formal definition of structural racism. And I should say there are other ways of talking talking about this idea of structural racism. Students might have heard this phrase, systems of oppression or systemic racism. These are, talking about the same thing, structural or racism. So here's a formal definition. So according to the Aspen Institute, which is a think tank, their stated aim, the Aspen Institute's stated aim is to create a free, just, and equitable society, right? And that's what our job is as teachers in a public school. The public school is a microcosm of the larger democratic society. So as a public school teacher, democracy is in my mind. It's in the forefront of my mind. So structural racism is a system in which public policies, institutional practices, cultural representations, and other norms work in various, often reinforcing ways to perpetuate racial group inequity. It identifies dimensions of our history and culture that have allowed privileges associated with whiteness and disadvantages associated with color to endure and adapt over time. Structural racism is not something that a few people or institutions choose to practice. Instead, it has been a feature of the social, economic, and political systems in which we all exist. Okay, that's a formal definition. It sounds a bit abstract, very abstract. Okay, so what I want us to keep in mind is that structural racism is created by people's actions, what they do and how they behave. What people in power do and how they behave are informed by how they think. Okay, structural racism then ultimately is upheld by habits of mind. And we all have to think about structural racism. It's not just the burden of, people of color. It's everyone's concern. It's everyone's project, especially if you are a public school teacher. So when the Supreme Court passed the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision, which I referred to already, but it's one I come to think about quite a lot. So that decision desegregated schools. But this didn't mean that integration happened with ease and comfort. In fact, quite the opposite occurred because segregation was a habit of mind. It was the way Americans moved around in their community. It was a habit of mind. So, public education is supposed to be the great equalizer. No matter your racial, ethnic, socioeconomic background, you have a fair chance at opening doors of opportunity that will lead you to achieve your full flourishing. Understanding structural racism is a project, as I mentioned, each one of us must choose. So if I might just talk a little bit about James Baldwin, my sophomores, we just finished reading The Fire Next Time. And the opening chapter is a letter James Baldwin writes to his 15-year-old nephew. So I do pairings, right? So I paired James Baldwin with our contemporary James Baldwin, and our contemporary James Baldwin is, of course, Ta-Nehisi Coates. So, I pair Baldwin with Between the World and Me. So in the opening of The Fire Next Time, Baldwin writes to his 15-year-old nephew, The letter is written to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, which, as listeners all know, I know the students probably know this pretty well, ended slavery in 1863. Okay, so The Fire Next Time was published in 1963. So toward the end of the letter, Baldwin says to his nephew, and this is 1963, he says, and if the word integration means anything, this is what it means, that we, and here he's talking about his nephew, himself, Black Americans in general, that we with love shall force our brothers to see themselves as they are, to cease fleeing from reality and begin to change it. For this is your home, my friend. He says this to his nephew. This is your home. Do not be driven from it. Great men have done great things here and will again, and we can make America what America has become. And of course, this last part is an allusion to the great Harlem Renaissance poet Langston Hughes from his 1936 poem, Let America Be America Again. So, the words integration and, even segregation is still part of our national vocabulary. Schools are more segregated than ever. And integration is a word I am using when I talk about the AAPI curriculum bill. Our goal is to integrate and infuse the contributions and history of Asian American and Pacific Islanders into the social studies curriculum. And, that applies to language arts as well. Students study American history. Students also study American literature, at least 1 year each. I imagine, at least in my district, American studies and American literature is taught the same year.
Sima, as I'm listening to you, I'm feeling very inspired, and I want more. And I keep wondering, like, as you're talking and you're talking about the habits of mind and people's actions, you are someone who has taken action. And in your presentation, you talked about your first teacher, your aunt, and you talked about your influential teachers. I mean, Mrs. Morrow, right? I mean, really powerful. Wow. I'm really ahead of the curve in terms of understanding like cultural representation and meeting the needs of our students. But what was the moment where you knew like you had to, she kind of called you on this, like use our voice. Like what was the moment where you said like, I need to use my voice and tap into my students' voices for this cause?
I mean, I think I knew it from the get-go, because I was teaching at the college level, and the mentality of the professors at the college level is, create an inclusive curriculum because we're a diverse country. That's the mentality at the college level. I didn't find that so much at the high school level. And so that was, I tried to get used to it, but I couldn't.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'm just a bit stubborn. I did try, I must say. I tried.
I don't think the get-go is when you became a high school educator. Thinking about the curriculum at this, because the get-go could be when from day one. But it's interesting when you enter the school system, realizing that there needs to be change. And that's really powerful in terms of like as an educator that you had that influence and that understanding that you could be that vehicle.
Well, yes. And it was only because this grassroots coalition is made up of these amazing people. And to tell you the truth, I haven't met any of them except for one person in, face to face. It was all virtual networking, virtual meetings, virtual, just planning. But these, and they're mostly women. There are a few men, but mostly women, and they're all professionals. They've got this amazing network of connections, and they just really, they lifted me up. Like everything I did, they lifted me up, and I reciprocate, of course. But
is there a coalition of students involved in Make Us Visible New Jersey?
Yeah, absolutely. There are. Actually, there were some students who testified, in support of the bills. Livingston has a very active AAPI club, and the
Okay.
Livingston AAPI club, in fact, testified. There's also another woman, young woman, Christine Huang, from Ridgewood High School. She's taken a really active role in this, and she also testified, and she's been invited to speaker events. She was, interviewed for a television program. I think it was a local New Jersey program. So she's really found her voice, and she's so young, and just so lovely in every way. And I think it must have been difficult for her, because her personal story is that she experienced microaggressions, and microaggressions are euphemisms for racism, right? She experienced racism as a young child.
That was what
that
the
really
students,
informed her activism.
the students were wondering, is one of the questions: have students in Make Us Visible New Jersey, or have students in the AAPI community experienced discrimination in the education system or in their schools? Are students talking about that?
Yeah, and it's one of those things, because of this idea that Asian students or students of Asian heritage are quiet. They might say something, but they just sort of brush it off. But there are very specific ways where we see discrimination, and I'd like to highlight that, if I might, just so we can recognize it.
Absolutely.
So just a couple of anecdotes. So in terms of just what I've been hearing, and this is specific to teacher-student relationships. I think, some teachers are just not familiar with names that are non-Western, and they have difficulty, with those names. So it's not necessarily discrimination, but they'll often confuse two Asian kids, get the names confused. So we just need to practice, right? Names are so very important. We need some sort of system to make sure that we don't call one Chinese American student by the name of the second Chinese American student who's in our class. I'd also say that teachers often assume that if a student who's of Asian heritage is not doing so great in writing, that they're ESL, or that they've just graduated from ESL, but that student could have, he's probably born and brought up here. So you can't just assume that if a student is of Asian heritage, that they were ESL. I don't think we make that same assumption of students who have recently immigrated from European countries. Okay, so there's this, I talk about two stereotypes. One is the model minority. The other one is, the stereotype of being perpetual foreigners. So that perpetual foreigner stereotype is something I think is very detrimental to a student, of Asian heritage, and their sense of belonging in their community. I think also there's this, assumption that, again, going to that stereotype of the model minority myth, that if you're Asian American, you're good at science and math. And there are a lot of Asian kids, who have an Asian background who just aren't good at science and math. So we can't assume those things. And if we do, it can hurt them. It can hurt their sense of self. It can hurt their development, as human beings.
Well, I keep thinking about your story, how you repeated multiple times, how you were miserable on a track that you thought you were supposed to be on, and how those myths or those perspectives were debilitating. And I imagine, thinking about, as you're talking about the model minority and the perpetual foreigner, if you could think back to your younger self, right, who was going through those experiences, what would you say to them now? In those moments, like before you get your MFA, before you're charged with Make Us Visible New Jersey, what could you have said to yourself while you were in those experiences that might have made your own process easier?
I think I just would have repeated to myself that I belong. I belong somewhere. Maybe not here, but I belong, and I'm capable, and I'm smart. I may not be smart in calculus, or maybe biology isn't my field, and physics definitely wasn't. Though I tried. But I just wish I'd had more role models. I mean, I wish, like I said in my opening, just the prospect of being a teacher just never occurred to me. When I entered teaching, I entered at the college level. I thought, okay, college, but I never thought, oh, high school, So some days in the morning, I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm a high school teacher. I never thought that this would ever happen. But it's a joy, and it's wonderful. Yeah. I love, teaching my students. I love, this age level. It's wonderful. They're always a delight. Every day is a surprise.
Oh, every day is different. Every day is different. And it keeps you young. You're constantly questioning and thinking. And so this question isn't on the list, and I have two more that I want to ask of our students, so I make sure that I cover them. Because you covered so much in your presentation. And so if anyone who's just joining us, you must listen back. There was so much goodness in Sima's talk. But how could colleges of education and teacher prep programs recruit more educators from the AAPI community? Like, what would make this profession more welcoming to AAPI students?
That's a great question. I think this program is a wonderful, way of recruiting more AAPI students to enter the teaching profession. I think we make up something like some minuscule amount nationally, like 1 or 2% of public school teachers are of AAPI background. So there are very few of us. But if you see other teachers who are from your background, you can then envision, that you could be that person as well. I mean, some of us don't need representation, but some of us do. I think if you're not living in a community where the majority of the people look like you, a representation really makes a difference. So I grew up in a community where the majority of people did not look like me, and I was really reaching and searching for role models. And so, getting a book like Bharati Mukherjee's The Tiger's Daughter, it opened up a door in my mind, that, oh, I could be a writer, Never thought of that. I thought I was only, I was supposed to just that straight and narrow path, follow my dad's model of success. And of course, my parents came here. They were the quintessential immigrants who wanted the American dream, and they achieved it. They just didn't realize that for their children, there would be challenges that they couldn't possibly imagine.
Yeah. Well, and I think they're unforeseen, right? There, like you said, you couldn't imagine that. And I suppose you can't imagine the next question I'm going to ask, but so this law, right, is now the word, and in 2022 we should see the integration of AAPI history in social studies classrooms. What is your hope for this legislation in its first year, in 5 years, in 10 years? What do you hope to see as a result of this work?
I'm glad you asked that question. So this isn't the only legislation that has ever been passed that has called public schools to create more inclusive curriculum. This is one of many. And I hope this bill, as well as the ones before it, the LGBTQ bill that was passed last year. The Amistad, commission bill that was passed like quite some time ago. There's even an Italian American, bill that was passed to
Holocaust and genocide.
to dispel stereotypes of Italian Americans. There are other bills as well, but all these bills have one goal, and that goal is to reflect the demography of the students in your classroom. And if you're in a district where, let's say hypothetically speaking, 70% of your students are of Latinx, Hispanic origin, as a district, as a teacher, you've got to include at least one text that reflects their experience. I know there's no perfect text. Talk about the entire Latinx, Hispanic experience, but at least, you've got a book, a short story, a poem, an essay. It matters. Kids need to see themselves in the story of America, in their social studies classes, in the story of America, in American literature classes. It makes a difference. It says, I belong. I'm here. People, people have come before me. So, I love all the contemporary literature. That's great. But I also say, go back to the older stuff. Don't forget about Maxine Hong Kingston's The Woman Warrior. If you're teaching world literature, don't forget about Midnight's Children by Salman Rushdie, and so forth. So the bill is specific to social studies, but it trickles down to the other subject areas, specifically language arts.
Yeah, I'm feeling really inspired, and I want to go in my room and pick out all the books. If we're like, this is right over there in my classroom, but you're right, it's not in the now. There is a history that has a place across all content areas, and I think that's so exciting. Just listening to you to see the ripple effect of all of these laws and how exciting, I keep using that word, it is to be in New Jersey, in a place where we're really trying to make that change happen. And you are a part of that. You're one of those game changers, Sima. So there are people on this call who might be wondering, what could they do to educate themselves further, or in anticipation of Asian American Pacific Islander Month in May, what resources are available to them to really start to build a greater understanding of why AAPI representation matters?
Yes, absolutely. So what I'm going to do is, in the chat board, I'm going to drop a link to a resource page, and you're going to find so many wonderful resources there. I think the best way to educate yourself about AAPI history and literature, because I'm a language arts teacher, I always have to add that literature part, is to celebrate AAPI Heritage Month, which, as Kimberly said, it's in May. And let's see, I think the second item on that document, which I'm going to actually drop in the chat box, is just some tips for, it looks like the link didn't replicate, some tips for how to celebrate AAPI Heritage Month at your school. And I'm going to share that link again on the chat board. So here we go. So this is tips for celebrating. A really quick thing, I don't know if it's quick, but it's fun. Something that you could do very easily is to organize a read-in. And this reading is modeled after the African American read-in, which has been around since, I think it's 1992 or 1994. And so, all you do is you select some text, poems, short stories. You get, people to sign up as readers, and you have a read-in in your media center. So that's something that you can easily do. And on the document that I shared, there is a list of, I think there is a list of poems and short stories and books that you might like to peruse through for an AAPI read-in. So there's a lot of wonderful stuff there.
Yeah, it's very exciting. I had to get up for a second because I have my copy of Midnight's Children right here. And my students, we have a world literature library project we're working through this year. And so my students actually selected this text. And just thinking of the read-in, there's a poem, and the name's escaping me, by Amy Nizuka Matato, and really speaks to like her teacher butchering her name and the visualization of that. And so there's access to making these stories human and accessible to all of us, and those resources are a great start. And so before I hand this back to Jeannie for the final set of questions, for the second part of our Representation Matters series, what do you hope the legacy of Representation Matters to be?
The legacy of Representation Matters. I mean, I hope we don't have to talk about Representation Matters too much longer. It should just be, part of who we are as Americans. And, I think the more inclusive curriculum is so very key to get our students ready for this new country that they'll be entering after graduation. The curriculum isn't keeping up with the demographic changes, it seems to me. This is just one person. It might be different where you are, Kimberly, but
you're right.
Yeah, what I'm seeing is that the curriculum isn't keeping up with the demographic changes in the public school classroom. And I was hoping we'd be, further along. But I guess, if you see something, at least for me, if I see something that I can improve, I've got to speak up. And I did take up the pen and started writing. So that's how I speak up, is by writing. And I published the article in NJEA Review, the October issue, and they're just great. I mean, I must, cheer the teachers up. They're amazing people there. They work hard, teachers.
Yeah. Well, Sima, thank you so much. But I really want to say that you've made Mrs. Morrow really proud. You have exercised your voice and then some. And so thank you. As a fellow ELA teacher, I'm always inspired by the work that my colleagues do, and the work that you're doing is changing New Jersey's future and subsequently, I think, the world. So thank you for that. And yeah. I'm going to hand you back to our host, Jeannie, if she would. I don't know if she's back on my screen.
I am.
Perfect. Awesome.
Yep. So
okay.
Wanted to say thank you very much. Sima, this was wonderful to see you and hear your story today. I almost felt like I was intruding on an English conversation for part of this. I think you guys should get together and have dinner or something and discuss some literature, I think overtime, right? That this can go over time. So I'd like to end today, and I told you, Sima, this is going to go a lot faster than you thought it was. We end every interview here at the Center for Future Educators with our list of common questions for every interview. So if you're ready, let's go ahead and get started. You ready?
I'm ready.
Okay, so what is your favorite word?
Okay, so this is the word. Can you see it on the screen?
Thursday, August 4th.
No.
Oh no.
Okay, so it's pucka,
Puka.
and it's from Hindi, and it's in the dictionary. So it's in English. It's a word derived from Hindi that reminds us that every interaction, historical or personal, there is an exchange, sometimes of words added to one's dictionary. So pucka is a word that you'll find in the dictionary, and it originates from my native language, which is Hindi.
Awesome. Oh wow. Okay. So this is the first time we've had awesome.
Is that the first time
favorite
someone ever
word?
said your favorite word? That their favorite word is pucka? Okay.
I dig it.
Usually it's no.
Yeah. So what's your least favorite word?
Okay, you're gonna laugh, but it's homework. It's homework.
Okay. If you could have any superhero power, what would it be?
This is easy. The ability to read people's minds. I'd like to know.
I don't know if I want to know, but there you go. What was your favorite subject when you were in school?
I did like history. I think it was because of Mrs. Morrow.
Okay. What subject or grade level do you wish you taught?
I wouldn't mind getting back to college teaching at some point.
What subject or grade level would you not want to teach?
Definitely not kindergarten. I mean, those kindergartens are adorable, but I'm not sure if I could handle them in the classroom. I couldn't
Every
keep up with
teacher
that.
has their little area that's their specialty, right? What sound or noise do you love?
So I do have a child, my son's voice, and the way he says his particular version of mother.
Oh, what
So
sound
he
or
doesn't
noise?
call me mother or mom. It's something else.
What sound or noise do you hate?
The shattering of a drinking glass.
Oh.
I've broken too many.
If someone were to play you in a movie version of your life, who would you want it to be?
Well, Priyanka Chopra, of course.
Yeah. What profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
Science journalism. I'd love to be a science journalist. You know, I could have used my science knowledge in some way.
And if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God or whatever entity say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
Okay, this was a hard one. I had to think about this one. I'd like him to say, or her, I'd like her to say, I've been waiting for you and you belong here.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. Well, thank you, Sima. It has been wonderful to have you with us today in our conversation about representation matters. It matters for a number of reasons, and I'm so glad we were able to continue this conversation about AAPI students as well, because I think that's another demographic that we're not paying enough attention to, and we absolutely need more AAPI teachers. So lastly, as we head towards the end of our school year for this year, please take care of yourselves. Say thank you to those who've had a positive impact on your life, and we will see you in September. Until then, take care and reach out to us if we can be of any help to you. Thanks so much, everybody. We appreciate you and your time. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.